Good morning, everyone. I remember as a child being asked to bring nickels to religious school to plant trees in Israel. The school was at a synagogue in Long Beach called, coincidentally, Temple Israel. The trees, we were told, were to beautify a land, an empty land that had recently been settled by Jewish refugees from Europe. This was easy for me to understand. My parents and most of my relatives and family friends were German refugees forced to leave their homeland. My mother told me stories about her village, how the Nazis made their lives miserable and dangerous. But she'd also said things to me like, our neighbors were never mean to us, and she had stories of how the town's mayor, after 1933, acted to protect her widowed mother and their family. My father grew up in Munich, where most of his friends were not Jews. Then one day in 1933, he went to the sports club he belonged to, and a new sign on the door said, "Jews not allowed." He could no longer associate with non-Jewish athletes who'd been his longtime friends. Both my parents were able to emigrate before things became very dangerous. Not so for many others in their families. In the late 1950s, my father became an active fundraiser for the United Jewish Appeal. I'd hear him on the phone explaining why Jews had to support Israel. It made sense to me. Jewishness. There was religion, but as a young teen, science seemed much more interesting. And then there was, in middle school, a game where kids threw pennies on the ground. If you picked one up, you were a Jew. I never picked up a penny. Even the one that was thrown at me in the cafeteria line one day by guys I thought were my friends, until I turned and one of them scowled, "Dirty Jew." So there was Israel, refugees, and prejudice. I avoided discussing religion, ashamed more than angry, and I kept all of this largely to myself. Then came the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement of the 1960s. My understanding of the world changed dramatically. It was from black people that I and millions of others learned that it was right to rebel against discrimination and racism. My naive view of the United States as a land of freedom and justice was shattered by fire hoses and attack dogs directed at protesters and assassinations of civil rights workers and leaders, and by Agent Orange and the napalming of Vietnamese villages. Around that time, my view of Israel also began to change. Israel, I discovered, was not a land without a people, for a people without a land, but a land whose native population had been violently driven from their homes. And those trees that my nickels helped pay for, they were planted in places where Palestinian villages had been destroyed. What I saw happening to the Palestinians did not square with a conviction that we Jews, who'd suffered so much from discrimination, should be the first to oppose discrimination against others. We began to realize that the admonition, "never again," was being perverted to justify oppressing others. So we had to take that slogan and add, "never again" to anyone. How could it be that we Jews, so horribly mistreated, were now acting as the oppressors of another people who had absolutely nothing to do with the injustices in Europe? To understand how that happened required learning how European colonialism has shaped, or better said, misshaped the world over the past several centuries, and how that imperialist system has pitted tribe against tribe, people against people, nation against nation. All this is vitally important to understand about our world, but this is far too big a topic to unfold in one reflection or one service. Zionism and its ties to all of this is also important to understand. That Zionism emerged from the soil of a racially oppressive Europe and the United States and bears the birthmarks of their racial chauvinism has been the subject of considerable investigation and writing. For those who want to explore this topic, there's a list of books I've found helpful. It's in the special page in your order of service. That many Jews after the Holocaust felt a desperate need for safety and looked for it in Israel, that too is crucial to understand. And why was that so? In large part because the Europeans, especially the Germans, murdered millions of Jews, while countries like England and the United States shut their doors to them in their hour of greatest desperation. I can say this with great certainty because this is exactly what happened to my own family. I spent the last few years writing about the Nazi Holocaust, how it destroyed much of my family, about how my grandfather, seeing a genocide approaching in 1941, carried out acts of resistance to it. In writing about the cruel deaths of members of my family, I was overcome and frequently cried. Today I cry for the Palestinians. But more than that, as we grieve for Palestinians, as we rage at the injustices that they have suffered and continue to endure, we need to be aware that we may well be approaching a crossroads for humanity. The very power of the events of these last months and the movement that has arisen speaks to that. Two potential futures that confront us. One with the kind of death and destruction we see in Gaza becoming even more widespread, and another more liberatory future. I sense a positive potential on the faces and in the voices of the millions, especially of the youth, who are beginning to awaken to fight against injustice, that this determination could develop and become a movement for sweeping social change is a frightening specter for the guardians of the status quo, some of whom are using the charge of anti-Semitism to discredit this awakening movement. What I am seeing in the evolving movement for Palestinian solidarity is Jewish, Palestinian, and other youth standing together in growing recognition that anti-Semitism and Israeli apartheid and all forms of racism and discrimination stem from the same systemic source. And it is crucially important to understand that source so that we can all move towards a world without such oppression and divisions. I believe passionately that we have to keep our eyes, our minds, and our hearts open, stay alert to new ideas and new possibilities, including revolutionary ones, and not be afraid to discard old prejudices and thoughts about that's just the way the world is, because the world is changing, and it needs to. All of us can choose how or whether we answer this universal call to never again for anyone. I know I must. Thank you very much.